Canadian troops prepare to defend their nation as helicopters hover overhead and tanks stand by. But this isn't just any invading force they're facing, it's the United States of America. Here's how Canada plans to defend itself from an American attack. Canada and the US have long been firm friends. However, with relations between the two nations no longer as strong as they once were, the idea of an American invasion has gone from impossible to an unlikely but possible scenario. It's something Canada has to prepare for, but it faces two enormous and even insurmountable challenges. The first is the border. The Canada-United States border is the longest in the world, divided into two sections, and the first section, nearly 1,500 miles, separates Canada's western regions of Yukon and British Columbia from the American state of Alaska. The second, even longer section runs nearly 4,000 miles, separating Canada from the contiguous United States. The vast majority of Canada's 40 million people live close to that border, with many of the country's biggest cities in the area. This includes the capital of Ottawa, as well as Toronto, Montreal, Quebec City, Vancouver, Calgary, and Winnipeg. Defending such a long and crowded border is a huge challenge. U.S. forces could basically pick almost any spot to strike. Canada doesn't have enough people to defend the whole border, so it would have to rely on intelligence tools to figure out where and when an American attack might happen, and then focus its resources there. And that leads us to the second challenge, the sheer difference in military might. On Global Firepower's military rankings for 2026, the United States holds the top spot, a position it's held without contest, year after year. It spends more on its military than anyone else, always boosting its defense budget to stay the top, toughest force on the planet. The U.S. has one of the world's largest armies, with more than 1.3 million active duty personnel and close to 800,000 more in reserve. The U.S. has some of the most powerful ground forces ever assembled, with thousands of tanks and hundreds of thousands of armored vehicles ready to roll out at a moment's notice. Its air force is just as impressive, packed with helicopters, fighter jets, bombers, and all kinds of aircraft ready to dominate the skies. At sea, it's almost unbeatable, with 11 aircraft carriers, more than 80 destroyers, dozens of submarines, and countless other ships. To top it all off, the U.S. has some of the best trained soldiers on the earth, with extensive experience of military operations all over the world. America is also one of the world's 9 nuclear powers, with an arsenal of over 5,000 warheads. By just about every measure that counts, Canada's military doesn't come anywhere close. Even though Canada is huge, the second biggest country in the world, stretching over 3.8 million square miles, its military only ranks 28th globally. That's behind much smaller countries like Thailand and Vietnam, and roughly on par with places like Singapore, Greece, and North Korea. For a country this big, Canada's army is tiny, about 63,500 active soldiers and 23,000 more in reserve. Canada's military also lacks the kind of advanced equipment and strength and depth that the US has. Sure, it has some land forces, but fewer than 100 tanks and about 21,800 armored vehicles ready for combat, a tiny fraction of what the US has. Canada's Air Force has a decent mix of planes, like the FA-18s, CP-140 Auroras, and C-130s, but it is no match for the US in numbers or firepower. At sea, it's the same story. Only 67 key ships, a handful of subs, and some frigates and patrol boats to guard its coasts. The comparison paints a very clear picture. The US military is much stronger than Canada's, and a straight-up fight would almost certainly end in a total American win. But war is never really that simple. History shows us it's not just about who has more or bigger forces. Smaller countries can still cause trouble with clever tactics, slow things down, or inflict real damage even against a much stronger opponent. And that is what Canada's plan ultimately boils down to. Before the invasion even begins, Canada would be counting on its intelligence sharing agreements with various allies around the world. State-of-the-art surveillance systems would detect any suspicious signs on the other side of its border. And since the US would need to gather a huge force to launch a quick, successful attack on Canada, Ottawa wouldn't take long to notice the buildup. And that is where the pre-invasion period becomes crucial. Canada's commanders would have to boost defenses, call up reserves, activate the Canadian Rangers, and keep a closer eye on the remote stretches of the border. Canada would also put its cyber command teams to work, shoring up defenses for key government systems, banks, and international communications networks. Publicly, the messaging would stay calm and measured to avoid panicking people. But behind the scenes, diplomats would be working non-stop, contacting allies like the UK, France, Japan, and Australia, laying the groundwork for quick responses, interventions, and diplomatic options if things get worse. This would allow Canada to prepare itself for whatever comes next. before a single shot was fired or a single pair of American boots has stepped onto its soil. Commanders would continue to monitor the situation as it evolves, deploying armed troops to key locations along the border. With Canada's surveillance systems and intelligence, the US would find it difficult to launch any sort of surprise attack. Instead, it would rely on sheer numbers and strength to overwhelm its opponent. US forces would likely start massing inland and moving toward the border, probably focusing on major population and political centers, like Toronto and Ottawa. The goal would be obvious: take control of key infrastructure as quickly as possible, break through Canada's defenses, and put intense pressure on its leadership in hopes of forcing a swift surrender. But surrender probably wouldn't be high on most Canadians' list. At the very least, the armed forces would want to put up a serious fight, showing the US they won't just roll over, raise a white flag, and accept defeat. The country would know that it would be at a severe disadvantage, but Canada would have certain cards to play against their enemy. The objectives would revolve not around victory, but instead on delaying and disrupting the invading force as deeply as possible. With limited resources, Canada would try to inflict as much damage as possible while using its home field advantage to buy time. The long-term goal would be to call in help from allies and, if possible, find a way to negotiate an end to the war before the US could take too much territory. In this way, Canada would take inspiration from countries like Ukraine. In its war with Russia, Ukraine knew right from day one that it didn't have the military might, the manpower, or the resources to go toe-to-toe with the Kremlin's army. Instead, it consistently focused on delaying and disrupting the Russian war machine. It used any advantage it could get its hands on and relied on support from its allies across Europe and beyond. Canada would have to do the same here. Canada would have to accept unavoidable losses as American forces pushed across the border, capturing territory and taking over towns and cities. It would know that it couldn't save them all, but it would fight to slow the advance as much as possible. The opening 24 hours would be key. As soon as an American invasion force arrives at Canada's border, the Canadian government would be compelled to declare a national emergency. Parliament would authorize emergency powers and activate continuity plans. Canada's military posture would shift from peacetime to defensive, with forces spreading out at key locations along the border. Rather than piling troops into a few key spots, Canada would likely spread them out in small groups, leaning on volunteers and reservists wherever it can. Even though there is no conscription, its Chief of the Defense Staff, General Génie Carignan, does still have plans in place to create a 400,000-strong reserve force made up of volunteers. This would give the country a much more sizable army to call on if and when the invasion kicks off. While not all of these troops would have any serious levels of military training or experience, they would be willing and able to lay their bodies on the line and defend their country. Recent polling shows that 72% of Canadians would be willing to take some action to defend their country. About 26% are ready to volunteer for civil defense, 13% for military service, and roughly 15%, close to 5 million adults, would even engage in violent resistance. So while Canada's army may look small on paper, the country actually has a much larger force than it seems, with people of all ages and backgrounds ready to step up. As we have seen in Ukraine and elsewhere, these kinds of volunteer civilian militias can be effective at delaying and disrupting enemy forces, even ones that are much larger and better organized. Canada would be grateful for every single able-bodied person that's prepared to fight. The various groups would rapidly receive their orders and objectives. At the same time, the government would start evacuation plans, moving as many people as possible out of the major cities, and maybe even out of the country entirely, seeking refuge in allied nations while the war continues. Aircraft and naval forces would be moved away from obvious targets, and Canada's strategy of spreading out its troops and resources would help set the stage for the battles ahead. By inflicting some early damage, Canada would make it clear that it intends to fight. After those opening strikes, Canadian forces would likely pull back to safer positions. With American artillery, missiles, drones, bombers, and jets overhead, staying in one place for too long would be too dangerous. Instead, Canada's best chance to slow the war and delay U.S. advances, and the core of its entire strategy, would be to rely on insurgency tactics and unconventional warfare. The U.S. would be able to take control of Canada's strategic land and sea positions in a matter of days or a week at the most. So Canada would have to take inspiration from other conflicts throughout history in which smaller forces have successfully fended off bigger invaders. And that doesn't just include Ukraine versus Russia. In fact, Canada's military planning so far has leaned toward a very different model, one inspired by the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989. Back then, Afghan rebels were facing an invasion by the Soviet Red Army, backed by Afghanistan's own military. They were badly outnumbered and outgunned, but they still managed to fight back by working in small groups, using hit-and-run tactics, sabotage, and ambushes to harass their enemy and slowly grind them down. Canada would have to do the same. It wouldn't want to meet U.S. forces in large-scale clashes. America's tanks, armor, and air support would simply be too strong to defeat. Instead, Canadian troops and fighters would lean on their knowledge of the local terrain and conditions, launching small, carefully timed attacks to catch the enemy off guard. Everything would revolve around asymmetric and delay-oriented warfare. Canada's units could, for example, seek shelter in the rugged northern and forest-covered regions, carrying out guerrilla attacks on American supply lines and choke points. They could also lay traps or even prepare improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, to use in ambushes against the enemy. The Canadian Rangers would be particularly important here. The Special Reserve Force includes thousands of highly trained personnel with deep expertise in remote surveillance and wilderness operations. The Rangers could act as scouts or local defense leaders, guiding small groups and helping coordinate attacks to give each operation the best chance of success, while keeping losses low. Canadian Special Forces would also be key, especially when it comes to coordinating high-value strikes on U.S. communications hubs and supply routes. They could plan attacks on key infrastructure, like bridges and rail lines, to disrupt movement and make it harder for U.S. forces to move troops, vehicles, and supplies around as they push deeper into the country. Canada could also copy the Ukrainian tactic of using drones to attack the enemy. This would be vital to taking out some of America's most valuable assets, like M1A2 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, with well-placed strikes. Even if U.S. forces attempted to counter those tactics, there would be so many groups spread across the vast Canadian territory, it would take a huge effort to hunt them all down. And this would all play into Canada's hands. Because once again, the objective here wouldn't be to win militarily, but simply to keep Canada's defenses viable for as long as possible, all while inflicting maximum damage on the occupiers. In the end, diplomacy would be Canada's best and really only path to ending the war as quickly as possible and reaching some kind of ceasefire with the U.S. While evacuation efforts continued through established safe corridors and out of the country, Canada would have to lean heavily on its allies to provide humanitarian aid for those left behind. At the same time, the country's emergency services would be under enormous pressure, working to supply food, water, and safe shelter to civilians caught in the middle. As a NATO member, Canada would also have to consider invoking Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. This calls on political, material, and even military support from the other members of the alliance. The problem with that plan is that the U.S. is a founding member of NATO, and Article 5 specifically refers to attacks from external parties, not member states. It would put NATO in a completely uncharted territory. Member states would have to figure out how to respond to a situation where the alliance is effectively turning on itself and undermining the very principles it was built on. Given that reality, other NATO members, especially allies like the UK and France, would be under enormous pressure to respond diplomatically and politically, if not militarily. Discussions would likely focus on how to bring the conflict to a ceasefire quickly and how to prevent the alliance from splintering. Any such invasion would undermine the very principles that NATO was founded on. The political and military effects could extend far beyond North America, potentially risking global security and forcing countries around the world to take sides. So while Canada clearly couldn't stop a full-scale U.S. invasion outright, the cost of carrying one out could be far higher than Washington might expect. Canada would take heavy losses, but it could still make the most of its limited advantages to strike back, all while clinging to the hope of a negotiated ceasefire or withdrawal. Its goals would be to protect civilians, preserve sovereignty, and win international support. And if it played its cards right, it could achieve all three to varying degrees, leaving the U.S. in an increasingly difficult position the longer the conflict drags on. Now go check out What If Canada Became the 51st State, or click on this video instead.